Welcome to Human Potential at Work, the show where we explore social impact, inclusion, and empowerment of everyone, including persons with disabilities. Get ready to be inspired, hear success stories, and learn tips and principles for bringing out the best in everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is Debra, and you are listening to or watching Human Potential at Work. My guest today has a new book. She has a podcast, and she has a very, very interesting story as well, and really wanting to take her story and make a difference in the world. So our good friend, Rick, introduced us, and I just have been watching her work for a while. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. And I want to welcome Sarah Price Hancock to the show today. And Sarah, maybe we can start by you just telling the audience a little bit about yourself.
Certainly. Well, I am a certified rehabilitation counselor with a specialty in psychiatric rehabilitation. I chose that because I lived for 17 years with symptoms of that were recognized as schizoaffective disorder bipolar type with catatonia. My doctors did not recognize that it was actually toxic encephalopathy. So I was treated as though I had schizophrenia and bipolar, and consequently it was treatment resistant. And so because of that, I was cycled through 37 different combinations of medications. And when that didn't work, I was also given shock treatments. But obviously that cannot address toxic encephalopathy. So now I live with an acquired brain injury and with delayed neurological problems due to low voltage electrical injury.
Which was done by the doctors helping you.
Quote, helping me, yes. They were doing their best, but they
right.
The problem is all too often in medicine, doctors do not look for an underlying cause of symptoms. They assume that if they see the symptoms, then that is the illness. Whereas in reality, with psychiatric illnesses, all too often there are underlying causes which are not being addressed by the traditional psychiatric medication. So for example, trauma or nutritional deficiencies, metabolic differences, hormonal differences. And in my case, I actually had a latent candidal infection. And so the candidal byproducts are 20 different alcohols, which my body could not process fast enough. And so essentially I was drunk for 17 years until we found the right treatment. But once I was on the right treatment, I no longer have any psychiatric symptoms. So it's exciting.
It is exciting, and it just goes to continue to show that there's so much we don't know about our brains.
It's so true.
Yeah, there's just so much, and we're going to learn a lot from these next few generations. We're going to learn a lot about the brain. So, you know, and I would also say that sometimes, I mean, this is documented that sometimes doctors don't listen to women's concerns in the same way that they listen to men's concerns, health concerns. And so women are often misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed, and that continues to be a problem. I think as we have more female doctors and medical personnel, that's helping, but that continues to be a problem. And I'm sure that probably played a little role in your journey as well.
I'm certain of it. And it's interesting. So often we want these simple answers, right? We want these simple diagnoses with a very simple, specific medication to address it. But the truth of the matter is, when you're talking of neurodiversity, there are so many competing factors. And it's oftentimes these symptoms don't manifest until it's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So for example, I live with the chronic candiditis, but I also live with casein sensitivity. I live with mold sensitivity. I live with just a variety of metabolic differences. I live with a variety of problems that created a cumulative effect, which can be very frustrating for doctors when they'll address the nutritional deficiency, and they will only see maybe a small change in symptoms. They'll say, oh, well, then it's not nutrition. Or they'll say, oh, well, maybe it's candida. They'll address candida, but the person still has symptoms. Oh, well, then it's not candida. When in reality, it's frequently multiple things. There's no simple answers to neurodiversity and improving the quality of life.
Right, I agree. Well, I know that you've recently written a book called Dare to Dream, Essential Tools to Finding Employment. And, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, why you did it, what the book is about, and, that journey, because it's a journey writing a book too.
It is a journey. Well, thank you so much, Debra. This book was an interesting journey for me because I had been told for more than a decade that I could not work, that it would stress me out too much, that I would, I was supposed to be on psychiatric medication for the rest of my life, and that was incongruent with employment. But the interesting thing was I really just needed some help in formulating my thoughts, because sometimes because of what I was dealing with, my thoughts were so scattered or so disjointed that it was really very difficult for me to present myself in a way that was professional, and also in a way that not only I could understand, but those around me could understand. And so, especially after the brain injury, I lost all of my muscle memory, so I no longer had the ability to type. Prior to ECT, I had been an editor for faculty papers and worked at BYU's publishing lab for the honors department. And I no longer had access to my vocabulary. So all of the crystallized traits that I'd learned from my college education were gone. So I really had to go back to the basics. And it was not helpful that everyone around me, they meant well because they didn't want to stress me out and see me get sick. But at the same time, it was very limiting because I was constantly being told that I couldn't work, that I couldn't live independently, that I couldn't even have meaningful relationships, and that wasn't in my life. That was not my quote prognosis. And very, very often we forget that everyone has their, just because someone has a diagnosis doesn't mean that it's going to be limiting their potential. And so I created the Daring to Dream project because I needed a systematic way to kind of organize my thoughts around employment. First, I needed to believe that I could be employed. I needed to feel confident. I needed to feel like it was even possible. So that was a big hurdle to overcoming learned helplessness. And so I discussed that in chapter 1. And then I go into identifying your preferred job title. I talk about developing your power statements, where you take your personal characteristics and then you present the personal characteristic or trait or identity, quality, value with an example that quantifies how you manifest that. I help people develop, they have a worksheet that breaks down like a me in 30-second statement or an elevator pitch. And then I give them, kind of walk them through the basics of job searching using, professional resources. For example, oftentimes the people who are working in employment, we assign people to help others with employment, assuming they know how to find a job because they're working. But being able to present that in a way where someone who's neurodiverse can systematically break that down and compartmentalize it and work through it can be challenging to someone who is not neurodiverse. And so I help people understand how to use ONET online and how to create a resume that's a functional resume using the same terms in the job description that they're seeking. I help them walk through cover letters and interview techniques. And I just really help polish people's professionalism as they dare to dream about being independent and finding a job.
Right. And you say that this is a book for people with disabilities, but that's very broad because
Really?
there are so many people with disabilities, according to the World Health Organization, 1 in 7, but now we have data that says 1 in 4 in the United States, 1 in 5 in Canada, 1 in 5 in the UK and in Europe. So we know the numbers are staggering, but also just because a person has a disability and is within that group doesn't mean they're not working or they can't work.
Exactly.
But there are people with what we consider in society more severe disabilities, and psychiatric disabilities would fall into that one, certainly, that the workforce just is not including for a lot of different reasons. And I know there's a lot of people working on this. And so I'm hopeful, especially some of the work we're doing with corporations. It's very interesting, but there's a lot of work to do. So talk a little bit more, because, as you lay out how you did the book, that actually could be a book that would be good for anyone that's looking for a job. Certainly for younger people that haven't worked yet, people that want to start a new job. So I don't perceive that as just for people with neurodiversity, but
It's,
yeah.
You're right. It's not. It's basically for anyone looking for employment. It could be someone, that just wants a summer job and they're in junior high or high school. It could be for someone who's decided that they're interested in a career change, or it could be someone, that's interested in going back to work after an extended absence. So it teaches the strategies and how to kind of circumvent some of the software glitches when you submit a resume to a large employer and they're doing a search for specific keywords. It teaches you how to identify those keywords. And so really this book can be used for anyone who's finding employment. And I structured each of the chapters. It's actually a workbook. So it has open-ended questions, and they're structured so that you can use it to facilitate a job club or like an employment group or workforce group to help people, get back on track or get
Right.
on track.
Right. And how we find a job has really changed so much. So it's the point that you were making about using the keywords and tying it to the job description that's being posted. Things like that are so critical. And I've talked about that a lot about, the group, the service providers that are supporting people with disabilities becoming employed, and the businesses that have expectations when they put out job descriptions that, you would actually be qualified to do the job. But does your job description, how old is it? A lot of job descriptions are so old, corporations are busy, everybody's busy, blah, blah, blah. So, but searching by keywords, that's how computers do it now. That's how
It's true.
artificial intelligence is doing it. So I really recommend that you check out the book. It's a really good one. It's a very structured layout, good for good for anybody that is, looking for a job or wanting to change a job or wanting to enter the workforce if you have a disability. So I also want to talk just for a moment about your podcast, the Emotional Self-Reliance podcast, which I've listened to a couple of times, and I find it's very strong. And I know we talked about it before we went on air, and I'm hoping you'll tell the viewers not only about the podcast, but why sometimes you don't get the podcast out as frequent as you would like, if you're comfortable talking about that.
Certainly. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful that you chose to listen to the Emotional Self-Reliance podcast. I've put my heart into it. Basically, what it is I share my own personal journey, and then I highlight wellness tools. I call them wellness tools because I really just don't like the clinical term coping strategies or coping skills. And everyone enjoys tools. I mean, here in America, we have like Lowe's and Home Depot, and give someone a $500 gift certificate there, and it's like winning the lottery, right? So my premise is that you can learn as many wellness tools as possible so that you can adapt yourself to any situation that you find yourself in. And as you become more adept at using your wellness tools, you will feel that confidence and become emotionally self-reliant. You will not need the validation from external sources that you are worth it or that you can achieve something, because you will inherently understand and feel that. And so the podcast kind of walks through that. Now, in terms of why I'm not as regular as I'd like to be, my goal is to be weekly. But as you can tell, I have kind of a speech impediment. This speech impediment waxes and wanes depending on the dystonia that I'm experiencing because of the electrical injury. So sometimes I'm unintelligible. And sometimes, like this, it's more intelligible, but it's not as intelligible as it could be. And so when I present myself in an audio format strictly, it's difficult for some people to understand exactly what I'm saying. So my goal is to be able to make it more accessible and to transcribe it and to even I have a friend who's interested in producing it in American Sign Language as well. And as I become more familiar with the technology, I will be able to make my podcast more accessible. It's designed so that I personally don't appreciate labels. My goal in life is to disable the label. And so when we can help people recognize that they are humans first, and then we begin to shed these labels that can frequently bind us. And in doing so, we can begin to see other people as people. And for example, this book, I am in rehabilitation, so obviously people say, well, it's for people with disabilities. But in reality, it's for humans. And so yeah.
Yeah, and that's what my whole program's about: human potential at work.
Exactly.
It's and I my producer Doug said, "Oh, love that, disable the label behind the scenes," and I do too, because we use labels often to disenfranchise people. We use labels to decide a person is not worthy. My daughter has Down syndrome, so she has an intellectual disability, so she's not valuable to the world. My husband
Yeah.
has a dementia through a traumatic brain injury, and
Yeah.
so he's going to add no value to the world, which I totally disagree with. And that's why the people that I have on the show, we're often showing what it means to truly be a human being, which is the varied, and there's a lot of components, and so I think labels are okay if we don't use it to hurt each other. And unfortunately, how we've used labels traditionally is we use it to disenfranchise people. So I agree with Doug. I like the disable the label. Let me ask you a couple of questions, because speaking of a traumatic brain injury, I know that with your traumatic brain injury, what was it like for you searching for a job? And before you answer, I have met so many people over the years, including the man that I married, that, are living with traumatic brain injuries. And my husband was hit by a car when he was 11 and died, and they brought him back. And it was a
Wow.
very, very severe brain injury. And unfortunately, it has now led in later life to dementia, which is a fun
Yeah.
journey. Not always fun, but it's life's a journey.
I understand it.
Yeah, it's just what it is. But it also powers my work. It continues to power the work. But often people with traumatic brain injuries are not able to go back to the workforce. And they are discouraged often from being in the workforce. And if you go into an employer and you say, I'm very qualified, I want to work for you, and blah, 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 and you've gotten to the point where you're being interviewed, and you tell somebody you have a traumatic brain injury, yeah, it's pretty much over for you in the US, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
so tell us more about your search for work when you have a brain injury.
I appreciate the question because it was very difficult. Because of my acquired brain injury, I lost the first 36 years of my life. So that's all of my work experience, that's all my educational experience, that's all my family vacations and development. So it was a very big learning process. I had to relearn how to read. I had to relearn how to do basic arithmetic. My friend taught me how to do double digit subtraction, and it took her a long time. I had to become acquainted with assistive technology, to retrain myself in reading and whatnot. And so presenting myself at an interview was difficult because they would ask questions like, tell me about an experience when, or tell me about a time when. And so that became difficult for me because I had nothing to rely on. And so I had worked with the LDS Employment Resource Services, and they're the ones who taught me about the power statements. And so they had guided me also in better exploring the employer's website and really taking good notes and really practicing those things. And so, for example, when I make those power statements in the book, that's what I used. I had to memorize them because people would say, tell me about an experience when, and I didn't have that readily available information to just tap into. So for me, that the power statements and the planned things were very critical. It was particularly difficult because, especially initially after ECT, I could not create new memories for about a year and a half. I could not create new memories. And so I looked at my available skills and I can talk. And so my the first jobs that I applied for were all receptionist jobs. They were all entry level. Didn't matter that I already had a degree. I couldn't remember access any of it or even remember how to type. And so all of my jobs were entry level. And I realized I really needed to tap into vocational rehabilitation because I needed to get retrained. I couldn't be a receptionist for the rest of my life if I wanted to be independent. And so, it was a very big challenge. I was blessed because my employer was impressed that I happened to be wearing green. It was a national tax company, and I had presented myself well, having prepared adequately, and I had worn one of my 2 shirts, and it happened to be green. And so I asked her later, I was like, why did you choose me? Because it was a panel interview. There were more than 200 people that showed up for the interview, and they interviewed us 10 at a time. And I'm thinking, Sarah with no memory got chosen. How did that happen? And she's like, well, you wore the company colors. And I was like, thank you. But then once I got into work, I realized that the importance of taking really good notes during training. And then I typed up all of those notes and I put them into a binder, which I called Sarah's Brain. I was so embarrassed about that because I really couldn't remember how to use and navigate any of the software or anything without that book. But I was very surprised how many of my coworkers came and asked to borrow Sarah's Brain. And it really normalized my disability. It made me realize that, yes, I have profound memory loss, but everyone deals with some measure of memory loss.
Right. I recently was reading an article that was about the start of Malcolm in the Middle, Frankie Monts, and he has sustained over his lifetime 9 brain injuries, and one really, really bad one in a car accident. And he doesn't remember anything. He doesn't remember anything from Malcolm in the Middle. He doesn't. There's so much he doesn't remember. And his girlfriend writes down, highlights of the day every day for him. And I do a lot of thinking about my wonderful husband of almost 40 years. And I think of, because I knew when we met, after he told me at some point that he'd had this really bad accident, but I knew him after the fact. I didn't know him before. And I remember one time when we were moving from Florida to Virginia, and he was going to apply for a job at Capital One, and he got the job. But I remember him saying, Debra, I'm nervous. What do I do in this interview situation? And he'd always been working since I'd known him, and I was sort of surprised by some of the questions he asked me. And and I had started noticing little things like when he would talk, sometimes he wouldn't make eye contact. And so I said, well, when you're talking to somebody, make sure that you make eye contact with the interviewer and, just try to relax and be genuine. And I gave him tips. And I remember he came home and he said, my interviewer actually had a lazy eye. And so, I don't know what you call that. My nephew had what I don't think we call it lazy eye anymore, but so, I don't want to accidentally use the wrong words, but when one of his eyes
Wondered.
Was in. So my husband was like, so I thought, what do I do? And I knew what I would have done. I said, what did you do? And he said, well, what I did was I just picked an eye and I said, that's exactly the right thing to do because,
it is.
It's just, it's interesting because now that we're on this journey with dementia, I think back over our life and I realize things that at the time I just did not identify as, you know, the brain injury. And that's okay too.
Yeah,
Once again, my husband is so much more than a diagnosis in this, but,
exactly.
and obviously he has an amazing brain because look what he was able to overcome, even though he had this horrific accident. So, um, but why was employment such a key component of, your recovery journey?
Well, I think in American society, whenever you meet someone, the very first question they ask is, "What do you do?" And it was such an uncomfortable silence for me when I was finally in a situation where I would put myself into a social situation and try to get out there, try to not be isolated, and then I would be constantly bombarded with that question, "What do you do? What do you do?" And it was just so dehumanizing for me to not have an answer and to know that there is an expectation. But more than that, I wanted to be a contributing member of society. I wanted one of my goals in life is to help people. And so I always knew I'd be in the service industry. I just didn't know exactly what that would mean. And so I wanted to make a difference in people's life. I wanted to do that. Initially, I was trained as in deaf education. I got my undergraduate in elementary education and took all of my courses with my friend who's deaf. And our plan was to go and become deaf educators. So I forget where I was going with that, but it was important for me to be able to demonstrate to myself that I was not a drain on society, that I was not merely a recipient of benefits, that I could produce services and products that would benefit other people.
You wanted to be a taxpayer.
I did. I do. I mean,
And I say
it's,
that all the time. It's like,
yeah,
stop deciding that people that have disabilities or have acquired disabilities don't want to work and contribute to society and be taxpayers, because you're wrong.
it's
You're wrong.
true. I wanted to be able to contribute. I mean, I am very patriotic and I want to be able, I recognize that there are seasons in our life where we might need to take benefits. We might need access to that. But then there are other seasons in our life when we can pay it forward, when we can make up for maybe what we've taken, or even more than that, we can pay back into the system so that other people currently going through that period of their life can get the help that they need and be lifted out of that situation as well.
Yeah, you know what? When you say about, I think of, put your hand out. I just met you. I'm going to shake your hand if I can shake your
Yeah,
hand, right? I'm going to shake your hand, and the first question is going to be, "What do you do?" And I hate to think about it like this, but immediately there's sort of a judgment, right?
there
So,
is.
what do you do? And I'm going to decide whether or not you're worthy of me spending more time with you at this party or whatever. But it's interesting it's interesting how we do that as society. And I became very conscious of it when my kids were little, and the kids would have guests come over, and I'm like, "So what do your parents do?" Just I'm really doing it to
It's
just,
small talk.
right, to make small talk. But I remember my son, who is always very evolved, saying to me a couple of times, "Mom, why are you asking that question? Who cares what are there?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know. I think I just must have been taught that over and over and over again to say that." But
Yeah,
he was the first one that really sort of called me on it, saying, why that, as the younger generation do anyway. I mean, you're much younger than me too, but it's just fascinating, some of the things that, and on my last show I talked about this briefly, but I have this amazing man that just started working with us, Lamondre Pugh. And
oh,
yeah, he's amazing. And Lamondre cannot use his hands in the traditional way, so he cannot shake your hand, but he'll say, give me a little fist bump. And he's just such a delightful personality. You're like, oh, I can do the fist bump. I'm not going to, but it's just interesting the things that we do in society that you don't even know where it came from. So, but let's talk a little bit about your wellness recovery action plan, your RAP plan, and how did it prepare you for the new employment and moving back into the workforce?
Oh, thank you. The Wellness Recovery Action Plan was actually developed by Mary Ellen Copeland, and it is an evidence-based practice recognized by SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration. And basically, she lives with a diagnosis, and she wanted to better understand what it takes for people to live successfully with symptoms of mental illness. And so initially, this was developed specifically for mental illness. But in my family, we have a variety of people with a variety of different symptoms. And so everyone in my family, all of us, even the caregivers, can use the RAP plan. It's a Wellness Recovery Action Plan, because essentially it just prepares you so that you don't burn out. So initially what you do is you recognize what you're like when you're well. Then you recognize the things that can be, quote, triggers or things that might prove challenging to you. Then you create a plan for that. When those things happen, you already have something in mind. So, I mean, for example, it's pretty simple. When I was growing up, my dad taught me right off the bat, he's like, if you ever don't feel comfortable when someone invites you to go to a party, just tell them, I'm sorry, my dad won't let me. And he said, and I'll totally back you up on that. And so having those prepared answers, so having the same, a RAP plan is kind of the same way. You plan ahead. You think, what happens when my wheelchair battery dies? Or what happens when my prosthetic becomes too sweaty and itchy and gross and I don't want to use it? You create these things ahead of time, and then you create an action plan to put in place. And then for caregivers, it's so important that we strengthen our caregivers. So even caregivers can create this, and they need to be able to recognize, when I'm starting to feel really stressed, I can no longer provide the type of care that I'd want to. So how can I get myself back on track? Then the next component is crisis planning. And, when you've planned for a crisis, the severity of the crisis isn't as acute, right? Because you already have that plan in place. You've kind of already done your dry run in your mind of the emergency.
Right.
And then it goes a step beyond that. All too often, especially when we're dealing with people who have illnesses that fluctuate, the symptoms severity fluctuate, we assume these responsibilities for them, assuming that they will no longer be able to take on those responsibilities. But the crisis plan, part of the crisis plan is helping your people know when the crisis is over so that they can begin to re-give you these responsibilities. And so,
good point.
Yeah, so it was interesting for me because I gave my crisis plan, or I give my RAP plan to my parents. I give my RAP plan to my husband. I've even shared it with some of my faculty members because I trusted them. I have shared it with an employer because it was one particular employer that I really trusted. But so then, they could see if something, we'd just be like, my mom, I was in acute crisis. I'd become nonverbal because the encephalopathy was so bad. I was pacing, I was shaking, I was flicking my fingers. My mom walked up to me and she put her hands on both shoulders and she said, Sarah, you have planned for this. Let's work the plan. And her voice was calm. She just said it very, very carefully and quietly. She looked me right in the eyes and it helped rein me in. It was like, okay, you're right, I have. And I'd called her, actually I'd texted her 911, I need help now, because I couldn't verbalize that I needed help. And so, if a parent gets that kind of text, that's going to be panicking, right? I haven't been blessed with kids yet, so I wouldn't be able to know that. But I know that if I got a text like that, like from my stepkids that are now grown and gone and never lived in my house, I would be panicked. But my mom had the presence of mind. Okay, let's get the RAP out. Let me take the RAP and let's see what we need to do to get Sarah back on track.
That's a wonderful story. I love that story. And it's like sometimes sometimes we lose control of our life. I know my daughter got very, very, very ill in the fall, and I had been managing things well with walk with my husband, own my own business, all the work that I do. And when my daughter got sick on top of everything else, I thought, okay, I don't know if my
Yeah.
hair, I've gone silver now, but it finished that work, and that's okay. I've earned every one of these silver, and I've added the purple just to highlight the beautiful silver. Uh, but we're talking a lot about this, including what you just said about your mom, and your mom was being very empathetic. And we don't
Yeah.
need sympathy, we don't need charity. Sometimes we just need calmness and empathy. So do you mind talking a little bit about the role that empathy plays in your life, and also in a positive work environment for people living with disabilities, and quite frankly for all people, right? Because we're all sometimes living with disabilities. It's just part of being human. It doesn't make you
It
broken,
is.
it doesn't make you inferior, it makes you human.
So let's see. I got lost in the
I
wonderful comment about
know.
humanity. So
Well, and
you
it's about empathy.
empathy.
Let's talk a
Yes.
little bit more about empathy. That was I and yeah, it's about empathy.
I think there is a very big difference between sympathy and empathy, and being able to help validate people and recognize that frequently they do have the ability to solve their own problems, being able to ask them those questions that can help reroute their brain, help them get to answer those questions. And when we present ourselves in a way where we are compassionate and just recognizing that they're human, that we all face struggles, and that sometimes those struggles can be more hard than others, but reminding them who they really are. For example, I had a man who was extremely stressed. He'd been waiting in the coffee line. He lives with a severe mental illness. We had a clubhouse. Something was going on in that coffee line that should not have been happening, and he was being bullied. And when he got his coffee, he turned around and just threw it all over the person that was behind him, bullying him. And he felt completely justified because he was being dehumanized and bullied, and it just pushed him beyond his thing. And so in that situation, I had to take him aside. And rather than reprimand him, I just, asked him what happened. And then I said, but I've watched you, and I know that you're not normally like this. I know that you're a kind person. I know, and I have a higher expectation of you. And I think I might have been the first person to ever say that to him. And he just, all of a sudden, he stood up a little bit taller and he said, "You're right, I am better than this." And, so often we're conditioned, especially people that are living with diagnoses of mental illness, they're conditioned to say, well, it's my illness. Well, that's just the way I am. I can't help it. When in reality, we're not broken. We just need to learn additional skills that can help us better polish ourselves and present ourselves better. And so, he walked back out into the main room and he apologized to the person, and he told the person, "I'm better than this. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." He apologized to the entire group. And, you know, I think the situation would have been completely different if I would have been reprimanding or sympathetic. Yeah, he was bullying and blah, 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 because this helped him recognize that as a human, he is better than what he had just done. And in recognizing that, he can go forward and continue to make better decisions.
And then everybody else in the room gets to learn from this experience as well, including the person that was doing the bullying.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful story. Why are you so passionate about teaching those with mental health concerns about the recovery model, and also about how they can return to the workforce if they want to?
That's a fantastic question. I am really passionate about the recovery model because the peer developed recovery model, when I say peer, I mean people with lived experience with symptoms. The very first, the foundation is hope. Then it's a choice and accountability, being accountable for the choices you make. I added accountability because, quite frankly, we can't have choices without being held accountable for them. And then being held accountable for our choices empowers us to make better choices. And then creating a recovery environment and then finding meaning and purpose in life. I mean, so often, for example, when I began getting better, it was shortly after my doctor had told me that there wasn't yet a medication that would help me, and that no treatment developed would help me. We had already tried 37 different combinations, every single medication on the market at the time, and ECT, and nothing was working. I was still having command hallucinations telling me how and why to kill myself 24/7, except when I was asleep. And so I was like, well, if you can't do it, I'm going to figure out how, because I can't live like this anymore. And I began looking at what my peers who are living successfully with their symptoms were doing. And that began, this group. My medications hadn't changed at all, but as I began strengthening my wellness toolbox and learning as many wellness tools as I possibly could, my ability to cope with the things that were going on around me, and even with my own internal dialogue and the voices and everything, began to improve. And as I began to believe in myself, then the fighting that was going on in the head with the voices, constantly criticizing me, I began to be able to ignore that. I really don't care what you say because I'm better than that, And so helping people recognize that they are not their diagnosis, that they are human first, and that their life does have meaning and that their life does have purpose, that is what is going to help launch people into achieving the independence, if they desire it, into creating the life that they desired. I mean, so often we have this dream of what our life is going to be like that doesn't manifest, right? And you don't have to have a diagnosis for that not to happen. And some of us are on, plan X, Y, or Z because plan A through F, fell apart.
Right. Yeah.
and normalizing that for people helps them realize, I am not unique in my plan falling apart. There are other people whose plans have completely fallen apart. Let's learn from them and build on it. Because I seriously, I really believe that there's no deadline on human potential. And some of us are just entering that gateway, beginning to recognize that there's no deadline. We've been taught about the developmental milestones and X, Y, and Z. Well, you know what? It took me 4 years to finish the last 1.5 semesters of my undergraduate education. 4 years. And it took me, 8 years to publish this book. So there's no deadline on human potential. We just need to believe that we can do it and continue to gather those wellness tools to strengthen our ability to do so.
I agree. And I just want to say for the viewers that might not know what ECT is, it's electroconvulsive therapy, just in case somebody's wondering.
And also known as shock treatments.
Right, which is so scary.
But it's the reality. They call it electroconvulsive therapy so that it doesn't sound as scary, but
correct.
The reality is
because we're all afraid of the electroshock therapy. Yes.
Well, but there's no standard procedures. So, there's no standard procedures. There's no studies on safety or efficacy. Yep. So when we hear people that have
brain, so
I know.
Yeah.
When we hear these stories of people who've had good experiences, that's great. But because no doctor has a standardized operating procedure manual, and there's no universal way to do it, you're going to have an outcome dichotomy that's going to be everyone from Kitty Dukakis, who's extremely satisfied with her experience, and someone like me who has to use a wheelchair at the beach. It's just, and stop breathing because I have a very weak blood-brain barrier. When I'm exposed to mold or sickness, it goes right to my brain. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, I wanted to make sure that the audience knows how to find you on social media, how to find and buy your book. And please, as a reminder, please buy her book, but also leave her a review. It's so hard to get reviews on our books. It's so hard, and the ranking is affected. So I think everybody can see why I had Sarah on the program. She's amazing and brilliant, and she is changing the world. But Sarah, tell the audience how they can find out more about your work and follow you and get your book.
Certainly, thank you. So my website is Psych Recovery and Rehab. It's PSYCH Recovery and rehab.com. My Twitter is at Psych Recovery. On Facebook, you can find me at Psychiatric Rehabilitation, Recovery and Rehabilitation. And let's see, I'm on LinkedIn as well, Sarah Price Hancock. I'm the only Sarah Price Hancock. And then, of course, my podcast can be found on iTunes and SoundCloud and Google Podcasts, and it's called the Emotional Self-Reliance Podcast. And right now, my book is available. It should be available. It's been submitted to Kindle, and then it's available. The softbound workbook right now is available through Brigham Young University's bookstore. And so I can send you a link for that so you can put it in your show notes.
Yeah, that would be great. And what I'll do is I'll make sure all of the social media, her website, the book links, everything will be included. We'll include that on our website when we begin to market her program. But Sarah, we really, really appreciate your time today. And you're an amazing woman. And I think you just continue to show us what people are capable of. And, you know, you are the reason why I created this show. So I'm really honored to have you on. And I look forward to watching your journey, and maybe you can come back on in the future and, you know, explain the next phase. But we really appreciate your work and everything you're doing.
I'm so honored that I was invited because you are doing phenomenal work too. I love listening to the podcast, and for me, it's like an extension of graduate school because I still get all of the diversity of all of the different people's experiences and all of the opportunities that are available for people with disabilities. So thank you so much, Debra, for your hard work.
And special thanks to Rick Sizemore for introducing me to Sarah, because he also has a podcast that's amazing. So, but all right, well, thank you, everyone. And we will see you next time. And I'll make sure I provide all the links so that you can definitely get in touch with Sarah. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.